I'm Tom Hiddleston, and today we're going to talk about the survivors of Pompeii.
A decade after the eruption of Vesuvius, the Roman poet Statius mused, "Will future generations believe, when crops grow again, and this wasteland is green once more, that cities and people lie buried beneath, or that their ancestors' fields fell victim to the same fate?" By then, the highway around the Bay of Naples had been reconstructed, with raised walls to keep wind-blown ash from covering the pavement. Behind the volcano, the Great Augustan Aqueduct, 90 kilometers long, continued to flow. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, however, had not been rebuilt. They never would be. This was not because all the former inhabitants had lost their lives. Contrary to popular belief, most residents of Pompeii and Herculaneum survived the disaster. Although the falling ash and pumice that marked the first stages of the eruption made travel difficult, there was a window, about 12 hours at Herculaneum and 18 hours at Pompeii, in which escape was possible. I asked Professor Caitie Barrett, who has worked at Pompeii for years, about the evidence for Pompeians trying to escape after the eruption began.
Some people's bodies were actually found on top of the pumice, so they clearly had waited until the pumice had already advanced quite some time before they tried to escape. So in the estate of Julia Felix, for example, the body that was found lying in the garden, which could have been, in fact, the remains of Julia Felix herself, was on top of the accumulation of lapilli. And a recent study of some of the casts of the remains of individuals who lost their lives in the eruption, mostly from the Porta Nola, that study showed that they were lying on top of the pumice layer. So they were actually trying to wade through it to escape, and some of them were trying to cover their mouths with their clothing. They seem to have died about 20 hours after the start of the eruption. So, I mean, it's awful to imagine what those individuals must have gone through. It does seem that a lot of people did remain in their homes, at least at first.
To date, about 1,150 bodies have been found in Pompeii and 350 in Herculaneum. But even if we assume that these represent only half the victims claimed by the eruption, thousands must have survived. In fact, tens of thousands, since the combined population of Pompeii and Herculaneum was probably around 35,000. In his recent book, Escape from Pompeii, Professor Stephen Tuck uses inscriptions to trace the survivors of Vesuvius. Most appear to have remained nearby, in cities around the Bay of Naples. At Naples, a neighborhood came to be known as the District of the Herculaneans, apparently after the refugees who settled there. In neighboring Puteoli, members of a Pompeian family sat on the city council and remained locally prominent for centuries. The Umbricius clan, which had run a thriving garum business in Pompeii, also relocated to Puteoli. Within a generation, they were shipping garum to Rome and beyond. At Cumae, a short distance down the coast, Domitian appears to have sponsored a massive building program meant, at least in part, to accommodate refugees from Pompeii and Herculaneum. The forum and baths were renovated, and a harbor and amphitheater were constructed. The Via Domitiana, still in use today, was built to connect Cumae and Puteoli with the Via Appia. In his recent documentary, Pompeii, Out of Time, Tom Hiddleston follows 3 victims of Vesuvius: the boy Avianius, the businesswoman Julia Felix, and a praetorian at Herculaneum.
In my life as an undergraduate studying classics at Cambridge, I always believed that Pompeii was covered by the blanket of the pyroclastic flow of ash and pumice and superheated rock instantly. I didn't know that there was time. what we would think of as about a day, 24 hours between the eruption and the burial. Time for individuals to make choices. Time, perhaps, for a teenage boy like Avianius to escape. Julia Felix, we know what she ran a business, a bathhouse for respectable people, balneum venerium non gentum, and we might think of it as a kind of spa, and that we discovered that there was she had evacuated the property. Nobody was found there, and the conclusion or the suggestion is that she organized a full-scale evacuation of the entire property, animals, clients, guests, and herself stayed behind because they found a necklace near the shrine to the goddess Isis, which historians suspect belonged to Julia herself. About the Praetorian soldier, in Herculaneum have been discovered traces of the Praetorian soldier, a sword, a military belt, and his military pay in denarii, which add up exactly to the paycheck of a Praetorian soldier in that time. The question we ask is, what's a Praetorian soldier doing in Herculaneum on the day of the eruption? It's an unusual place to be, but perhaps he is on what we might consider leave. Perhaps he's taking some R&R. This is where the archaeological record runs out, and one makes educated guesses or leaps of imagination. But there is enough evidence to know that these individuals were there, and that based on what we know about the circumstances of their lives, whether they survived or whether they did not.
Domitian's projects around Cumae were likely an extension of the relief program begun by his brother and predecessor Titus. In the immediate aftermath of the eruption, Titus sent 2 high-ranking commissioners to supervise relief efforts, ordering that the assets of those who had lost their lives in the eruption should be committed to the cause. Some of these funds, to judge from inscriptions found in cities all around the Bay of Naples, were used to reconstruct buildings damaged by the eruption and the earthquakes that had preceded it. At Pompeii, buried less deeply than Herculaneum, there were extensive efforts to recover valuables and expensive building materials in the years and decades after the eruption. The Forum was stripped of its columns, the lead tanks of the water towers were removed, and marble facings were scavenged from the suburban baths and many houses. Near the entrance of one heavily tunneled Pompeian mansion, archaeologists found the message, "House opened," left, apparently, by a party of looters. I asked Caitie whether she had encountered any evidence for post-eruption salvaging in her work on the houses of Pompeii.
Quite a lot. So this seems to have started immediately, and we can imagine the survivors as well as people from the surrounding area. They knew where Pompeii was. Some parts of the city were still visible above the volcanic debris. So right after the eruption, we see evidence for people trying to dig to salvage valuable materials, such as the statues from the Forum, for example. And even in later periods of what we would call antiquity, within the time span of the Roman Empire, there's evidence for reoccupation of some parts of Pompeii. This has been a really exciting finding from the archaeological park's work over the past year. In the Insula Meridionalis in the south of the city, where the upper levels of buildings were probably still visible over the volcanic deposits, there seems to have been reoccupation of some spaces into as late as the 5th century CE. So Pompeii had a long afterlife beyond the 79 CE eruption. There's a 12th century map of the Roman Empire, of the roads of the Roman Empire, which seems to be a copy of a late antique map, which still correctly lists the location of Pompeii and other Vesuvian cities. And then we've got evidence for more sporadic digging subsequently in the medieval through early modern period. Amedeo Maiori, who excavated in the area of the garden of Julia Felix's estate, says he found what he thought were medieval burials above the level of the ash. So people didn't stop being active here. And the site that my team excavates, the so-called House of Queen Caroline, I co-direct a project that works there. And one of the research questions that we have to address is, when we see evidence of disturbance, is that ancient or is it post-eruption? So, for example, some of the floors in the house, there are rooms that once had beautiful, highly decorated marble floors, and those have been removed. And so one question we have is this evidence for repair and renovation that people were doing when the eruption interrupted them? Or is it evidence for early modern 19th century, not later than early modern, but activity having to do with the earliest excavations at Pompeii? Often it's hard to tell the difference, although there are certain ways one can distinguish the two, of course.
There was limited resettlement in parts of the city. As Caitie mentioned, recent work on the Insula Meridionalis has revealed the existence of a shanty town that grew up after the eruption. The settlers lived in the upper floors of houses and warehouses that projected above the volcanic debris, using the buried lower rooms as cellars. Just outside the city, archaeologists have discovered post-eruption occupation levels in a bath complex and several seaside villas. Some degree of settlement seems to have persisted until the eruption of 472. Yet there was never any organized attempt to rebuild the infrastructure or public places of Pompeii, which remained buried until the excavations of the 18th century. In part, this reflects the difficulties of dealing with the debris that covered the city. The eruption had buried Pompeii beneath up to 6 meters of ash and pumice, a layer too deep to clear away and too unstable to build upon. Moreover, since ash and pumice are highly porous, the landscape around Pompeii was unable to retain moisture. It took decades for the volcanic debris to consolidate and become fertile. Even if there had been the political will to overcome the practical problems of reconstruction, Vesuvius refused to cooperate. The mountain appears to have remained active long after the disaster of 79. Statius notes continued eruptions in his poem. Galen, a century later, mentions that Vesuvius routinely produced clouds of ash. Cassius Dio records an eruption in 203 AD that was loud enough to be heard in Capua. With the volcano so active, any attempt at resettlement must have seemed foolhardy. In any case, there was no political or economic need to rebuild Pompeii. As the Roman authorities discovered, the former residents could be far more easily accommodated by repairing and expanding neighboring cities. Plutarch, writing a generation after the eruption of 79, claimed that even the locations of Pompeii and Herculaneum had been lost. This, as we've seen, was an exaggeration. In Plutarch's time, the site of Pompeii would have been dotted with impromptu excavations and clusters of houses, with gardens planted in the increasingly fertile volcanic soil. Neither then, nor even in the Middle Ages, when an inscription from Pompeii was built into a local church, was Pompeii truly forgotten. The discoveries of the 18th century only apprised the world of what locals had always known, that a Roman city lay just below the surface.
I think what's extraordinary is I believed that previously that there were no survivors. And it's interesting as an avenue of intellectual exploration and curiosity to think about the extent to which a place is represented by its buildings or its people. And the idea that there were survivors of Pompeii who escaped the volcanic eruption makes me think that there was a part of the legacy of Pompeii which endured, because people from Pompeii survived, would have resettled, would have reorganized their lives, and carried on their local or family traditions, carried on the legacy of Pompeii. If it had been destroyed and all of its people, then it exists as a final conclusive record of a particular time. But I don't believe that's the case anymore, and it makes me wonder about what elements of ordinary life in Pompeii were preserved in their customs and rituals and values and practices that all those survivors would have taken on into their new lives. Just as we can imagine with a very contemporary situation when there are natural disasters in our world and there are survivors, and those excuse me, those survivors become refugees, but they don't leave their practice and their culture and their tradition behind. They take them on and reinvigorate and revitalize and recontextualize them in a new environment.
Check out the Told in Stone Patreon, linked below, for my full interview with Tom Hiddleston. Next spring, join me as I explore the Roman ruins of Tunisia. We'll visit Carthage, Duga, and many other fascinating sites. Follow the link in the description for a full itinerary. You'll also find a link for my May 2027 tour to Jordan, which includes Jerash, Roman forts, Crusader castles, and, of course, Petra. Please check out my other channels, Scenic Routes to the Past and Told in Stone Footnotes, and, as always, thanks for watching.